I am glad you are here. We have never had more ways to hear about the divine within the quiet of our own routines. 1,000 voices resting in our pockets, an endless stream of devotions, a perfectly curated playlist of truth available the moment we wake. We hold a smooth, polished riverstone in our hands. It feels good to hold. It fits perfectly in the palm. But look at the base of Mount Sinai. The smoke was still thick in the air. The ground had barely stopped shaking, and the people looked at the terrifying reality of a God who speaks from the fire, and they decided they wanted something more manageable. Aaron took their gold and fashioned a calf, and he didn't call it a foreign idol. He proclaimed a feast, saying, "These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." They didn't reject God, they customized him. A customized faith is a comfortable faith. It allows a man to select the promises and skip the judgment. It gives the comfort of the holy without the terrifying proximity of the holiest of holies. You see it in the book of Judges. A man named Micah hired his own personal Levite. He built his own shrine in his own house. He set up his own private spirituality, saying, "Now know I that the Lord will do me good, seeing I have a Levite to my priest," a private faith. A personal chaplain. A perfectly controlled environment. The altar is built to exact specifications. The incense is measured to a preferred liking. The daily devotion arrives on a glowing screen precisely at 7 in the morning, demanding nothing but a passing glance before the day begins. But when the famine strikes, when the raiders come to the door, what exactly is Micah praying to? This is what we might call the illusion of intimacy. We mistake constant digital access for actual spiritual presence. A podcast in the car, an app glowing in the dark, a community that exists entirely in the ether. We engineer a spiritual life that never requires us to look a grieving brother in the eye or confess a sin to a living soul. And it works. It works brilliantly, right up until the sky turns to brass. In the days of Elijah, 450 prophets gathered on Mount Carmel. They had the numbers, they had the energy. They had a religion perfectly tailored to the culture of their day. They leaped upon the altar, they cried aloud. And the text delivers one of the most terrifying verdicts in all of Scripture. But there was neither voice, nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. The silence of a customized God. Take a moment and tell me in the comments, where have you seen the modern church trading the fear of the Lord for mere convenience? That smooth, polished stone, still right there in your pocket. You can reach for it every time the screen lights up. You can carry it anywhere. But it has no weight. It has no roots. It is entirely severed from the terrifying, immovable mountain it was meant to be part of. The Almighty does not download into our preferred formats. When Job demanded answers, when he wanted God to explain the suffering on terms Job could understand, the Almighty did not send a comforting proverb. He answered out of the whirlwind. He asked, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Job looked at the untamable beasts, the Leviathan, the behemoth, the sprawling, uncontrollable sovereignty of the Creator. And Job put his hand over his mouth. Not because he finally received a daily notification of peace, because he realized the stone in his hand was nothing compared to the avalanche of God's holy presence. Will you drop the stone and return to the mountain?